When I did my list of Sega's System 16 games, I only really had the intention of also covering the Model 1, 2 and 3 titles for later on in another video. But, well, I do love me some Sega. They're kind of my favourite games company after all. I probably wouldn't be gaming now if it wasn't for them, and a lot of that has to do with their arcades. So I've decided to greatly expand my look at Sega's arcade games and create a few videos on their arcade history. This one here is going to look at their earlier years, from the late 70s to the mid 80s to be precise. In doing this, instead of covering a single arcade board as we've done in the past, I've collected a few boards together alongside some machines that had their own unique board. So this video features most of what came before the System 16 board as a result, starting with the VIC Dual from 1977, going through System 1 and System 2, and also featuring little things like the Sega Zaxxon and other miscellaneous machines, mostly Z80 typos. In the end, there's 68 games to be poured over here, including various games not necessarily by Sega, but that were licensed by them and distributed in other areas. This isn't everything, mind you. I've decided that Sega's Vector and Scalar machines are worthy of a video all of their own, seeing as they are especially important to the company's history, so watch out for that soon. In later videos we'll cover Systems 18, 24, 32 and C, the Saturn-based STV board, and of course the Model 1, 2 and 3 boards. Hopefully that all sounds pretty awesome. But let's get on with this list, hopefully filled with historical information, some good old-fashioned weirdness, some games that are naturally a bit iffier, and some cool arcade classics. Let's go, otherwise it's going to take ages. Right at the bottom we have Safari. This is, as you can see, really early to the point where it's barely a game. All you do is shoot animals because, well, you're on a safari and that's just what you do apparently. Most of them still skid along after they've been shot and knock you over anyway. You play this for a fixed time and there you go. Games were obviously much simpler in the mid-late 70s, but it's still hard to imagine this being fun. Similarly, Frogs features nothing more than a frog jumping up and down and catching flies. There's not much else here. Do it enough in the time provided and set a score. What a fine game, but don't let Dad get hold of it. Yeah. Jumping forward many years indeed, we have Block Gal, which is a rather bad Arkanoid type game. Incredibly cheap and nasty, you'd be quite surprised to see that it actually is an official Sega title, created by Vic Tokai. The only appealing point to anyone here is that each completed level brings with it a piece of a lewd picture. So the only motivation to shove money into this machine is to reveal some cheap anime scud, and then what are you going to do after you reveal the whole thing exactly? Masturbate furiously, right there in the middle of the game centre in front of everyone? I mean, I'm sure some people probably did do that, but really? This sort of thing's rather pointless and daft to me. RAZZMATAZZ is, I presume, a follow-up to an earlier and more popular Sega game called Carnival, which will also be in this list. And while there's graphical improvement and a few different stages and so forth, it's all executed very poorly. This shooting gallery type game is annoying and juddery beyond belief. The original is infinitely more appealing. The old Sega arcade game SWAT is one of the great mysteries of life. Almost no one who's heard of it has any clue how to play it, and I sure as hell don't. It takes a cocktail of various elements from other games, particularly Sega's own Pengo, and mashes them up in an utterly befuddling and not fun at all package. The SWAT name is hardly fitting for something where you push blocks around and try to crush monsters, sort of. Block pipes-ish? I don't bloody know. It's kind of useless as an arcade game, isn't it? Turpin is a single-screen maze game that apparently involves rescuing turtles. To do so, you run aimlessly around until you can collect a bomb, which you can then use to blow up one of the other turtles that are chasing you, and it's as dull as it appears. There's quite a few single-screen maze games on this list, as you might expect, and the best ones are all utterly fast and immediate. This is neither of those, and to be honest, it's kind of awful. Here's Flower. It's a space shooter where the enemies are flowers, done in a very vaguely early Toaplan-esque style. Flowers aside, it's one of the most generic space shooters I have ever come across. And we have multiple Space Invaders clones on this list, so yeah, kinda generic. Speaking of which, Invinco is an early Space Invaders clone. It moves considerably slower than the original, and the sprites are quite clearly much worse. The only thing this really does differently from Space Invaders is that one of the rows of sprites disappears every now and again. Other than that, yeah, Sega were not always the most original bunch. Here's another from the Did Not Grab Me pile, which is a shame as normally I can go for a neat top-down shooter. We've got some really cool ones coming up, but Mr. Viking? Nah. It plays like a much worse version of the Ninja, which is another one we're going to be seeing later on. I hardly need to tell you to play that and not this. I do believe this is our first tie-in game, and as far as tie-ins go, it's odd. The Yoko-chan in the title is, I believe, a popular Japanese idol of the mid-80s time period this came out in, and the UFO is, I presume, a link to Nissin's popular brand of instant ramen. The game is completely kooky, with a great presentation that's filled with odd Japanese touches and cute parodies. And so it's a real shame that the actual gameplay is just so bad. The side-scrolling level, which is as far as I got, is virtually uncontrollable. Ugh, if this had been in any way better, I'd have stuck it a lot higher purely on presentation alone. But I can't give a high spot to something that fails this much on the actual play front. We are still in the realm of weirdness. A rather old and obscure magazine cartoon strip provides the inspiration for a game called Pig Newton that I'm not sure actually ever came out. Your job is to collect the eggs from up a tree because, well, you're some perverse monster who doesn't believe in farming eggs responsibly, and you'll just nick them from nests instead, ruining little birdie families for the sake of a friggin' omelette. In this context, the wolves cutting down the tree and the squirrels bonking you on the head with acorns are actually the good guys, trying to stop you from stealing and no doubt killing these poor little chicks. And they certainly do a good job. Thanks to them and the general irritating controls that this game possesses, you're not going to get far before you chuck this gubbin straight into the bin. But if you really want to play as the villain, you've got to go for TRANQUILIZER gun. I believe this was popular enough to at least warrant some notoriety back in its time, and it has not held up today. It's almost like Safari. Your job is to go into the jungle, shoot animals, capture them, and then take them off to your truck. Presumably you will then sell said lions, elephants and apes and snakes and all that for profit to some zoo or exotic market or various other ne'er-do-wells, because you are a bastard. Here, as anointed by God, man holds dominion over his earth. The game itself isn't exactly good or anything, but the aim of the game, where you play as quite literally a poacher, yeah, that's really not held up well, to say the least. Here's something more generic then. Space Odyssey is fairly ambitious for 1981 in that it contains both horizontal and vertical shooting sections. Not bad, seeing as this game does predate Salamander by a good few years. However, while that game was a success, this just can't pull it off as it's too juddery and rickety to enjoy. The sort of game that is unfortunately at a bit of a disadvantage here. What might have been quite impressive back when it was released certainly isn't after nearly 40 years, and that was the game's selling point. At least you're not gunning down innocent animals in this one, mind you. Space Attack is an even more blatant Space Invaders rip-off than Invinco, although it does at least look better. Amusingly, there's very little this game even bothers to do to differentiate itself from Taito's classic. The only thing I can see is that the UFO stays on screen a little longer at the end of each wave, allowing you more of a chance to grab a bonus. I mean, it's Space Invaders. There's little else to say. Space Invaders wasn't the only game Sega were happy to ape. This one here, Digger, is essentially an American version of an important Japanese computer game called Henko Alien, released under the Gremlin name that Sega bought back in 1978. You dig holes, aliens fall into them, and then you bury the sons of bitches alive. Once again, you do have to admire the cruelty of very early arcade games. The game itself is not exactly a winner. Neither it nor the original have held up to the relentless passage of time. Still, this is a version of what is the first ever maze chase game, and the likes of Pac-Man wouldn't exist without it, meaning that this and Henko Alien are certainly worth knowing about. Deep Scan is an old chestnut of a game that you may have seen in various forms over the years. I seem to remember there was a similar game on one of the Windows Entertainment packs. I might be wrong about that. You can also find it on the 2600 where it was called Subscan. Anyway, it's the game where you fire depth charges into the ocean and try to hit submarines, getting more points if you hit a submarine in deep water as opposed to ones in shallow water. The original version of the game, Depth Charge, was released by Gremlin in the days before they were bought by Sega, that being Gremlin the US arcade company, not Gremlin the Sheffield computer company. And so then I guess Sega released their own version after buying them up? That seems to make sense. It's not a terrible game particularly, just a very old one. I'm not sure that we in the West appreciate just how big an arcade monolith Namco's 1983 game Xevious is. It didn't particularly set arcades all a home on fire over here. But one quick look at the game's Wikipedia article will tell you that in Japan, Xevious was a monster that sold as many units as frickin' Space Invaders, one of the most successful cabs of all time. The game's first home version on the Famicom is arguably as important to the initial success of the console as Super Mario Bros. Was. Naturally, success breeds imitation, and just like Space Invaders, everyone and their mother ripped Xevious off, Sega not being any exception. Guardia is one of a couple of Xevious riffs that strictly follows the top-down bullet and bomb formula, but something about it is just gonna lack the original's panache. My Hero came out at around the same time as games like IOM's legendary Spartan X or Kung Fu Master, meaning that some very generous people often give it a co-credit as helping to popularise the beat-em-up genre. Unfortunately, My Hero is a much worse game than Spartan X and is honestly utterly cack. Garish as hell, filled with complete bullshit one-hit deaths you can't possibly hope to see coming, and no fun in any way. You could still get a kick out of Spartan X in 2020, but I don't think anyone got a kick out of this even back in 1985. Inexplicably ported to the Master System a year later, it was just as crap in the home. Geez, this is quite an obscure one. The ultra-generic title doesn't help, and Brain itself is a pretty generic horizontal shooter that switches between spaceship action and jetpack action. It's one of several games here developed as a collaboration between Sega and a studio called Corland, who would later become more famous under the name of Banpresto. Like a few of Sega's titles here, the ideas aren't bad or anything, but the game lacks something and is pretty bloody ugly technically. We continue to wade through a veritable mudslide of mediocrity as we enter the top 50 for Sega's early years, but we are at least getting a variety of genres. Shooting Master here is the only light gun game on this list and, well, there's not too much to say about it. You've got to save a woman from being kidnapped by a bunch of hoodlums, while also avoiding getting shot yourself. Unfortunately, I can't play this game in the traditional way and have to make do with a mouse, which does hamper things a little bit, but if I happen to have a proper light gun setup, well, needless to say, this would not be the first game I chose to play. Hopper Robo is another in a very long line of early Sega titles that aren't exactly original. This one, as you can probably tell immediately, is quite Donkey Kong-esque. It's not all the way there, you have to collect the boxes in sequence rather than just get to the top, and there are actually some quite fun elements to the design that make this a not too bad single screen platformer as opposed to something more derivative. That said, it is quite obscure. Sega barely admit to its existence, and it has been speculated that this may be because they didn't actually create the game. It was ghost developed by a little known company called Orca, and those guys made a perfectly okay game. Probably deserves a little bit more recognition. Sega actually did have a pretty important part to play in the maze game genre, which we'll be examining in a few games' time. Indeed, some of their best early titles are maze games. SINDBAD Mystery, Misspelling and All isn't necessarily one of their best dot collectors, being very much in the classic Pac-Man mould, although it does stand out by having a very sharp multi-tiered maze design. It's also quite a challenging title too, with some very aggressive enemies indeed. There are certainly better Sega mazes than this one, although it's definitely a few levels above games like Digger and Turpin. One of the last titles to be released in the System 2 range, and coming out as late as 1987, Chrono Soldier is another one that few people really know. By this stage Sega obviously had many much more impressive arcades out there, and this one never left Japan. It's a regular top-down shooter style game, with the twist being that your main weapon is actually a punch with a limited range. This makes the game slightly different from your normal Commando or Ikari type game, but also makes for a game that's a bit slower than most would probably like, certainly me. It's quite behind the times for 1987. I mean, Sega had Alien Syndrome out by this time. Would you rather play that or Liss? Liss never had a chance, I'm afraid. Next up we've got a really early one. Space Trek dates back to 1980 and is a much less derivative addition to the space shooter genre than the games we've seen up to this point. There's little elements to be found from Space Invaders, naturally, and it certainly fits neatly along with contemporary games like Galaxian, although if I had to name one game that this specifically reminds me of, I'd have to say it makes me think of the early microcomputer classic Arcadia by Imagine, which came out a couple years later. It's the usual deal. The ships fly around in fancy patterns, and you must get them before they get you. Unlike Space Invaders or Galaxian, you can actually move up and down as well as left and right. Utterly simple, but yeah, games like this are generally pretty fun. Another Sega and Corland collab, 4D Warriors is the sort of title where you can see the skeletons of better games in its creation, but the game itself is not bad. Despite the name, it's not all that four-dimensional. The gimmick comes from having both horizontal and vertical areas, the game switching pretty quickly and suddenly between them, and that being accompanied by some rather texture-warpy transitions that really aren't impressive nowadays. That said, it's not a bad game at all, a forerunner of better games of this type that would be created by the likes of Capcom in the years to come, the likes of Sidearms and what have you. Hailing all the way from 1980, N-Sub is the inverse of the super early arcade game Depth Charge that we saw a little earlier under the name of Deep Scan. Here you play as the sub and you're operating in deep water, firing torpedoes either vertically or horizontally. Naturally you'll get more points for hitting ships closer to the surface, but you've also got to be aware of ships on your level that are attacking you a lot more directly. Generally that's what the horizontal torpedoes are for. I find this variation on an ancient game to be considerably more fun because it's a lot more action packed, although the graphics are a little bit odd even for a game that's 4 decades old. Good clean fun. GB isn't a game by Sega. Originally it was by Namco, but was brought to North America by Gremlin and then brought over to Europe by Sega, hence why it's on the list. We're going to see some weirder cases of this happening later on. Anyway, this game, originally from 1978, is a cool little variation on Breakout that mixes the arcade classic with some pinball touches like bumpers and what have you, and having multiple paddles to control. It plays quite nicely and actually makes you wonder why there aren't more Breakout type games that try to ape the design of pinball tables. This holds up very well for such an old game. Future Spy is the spiritual sequel to a much more famous game that we're going to be seeing a little later. It's an isometric shooter in much the same style as Zaxxon. Actually, I'm not sure if calling it a spiritual sequel is correct. It's just different in that you can't actually adjust your height in this game, but you can now drop bombs on grounded enemies. Zaxxon is obviously one of the most popular and important early Sega arcades, although it's also a game that I am honestly awful at, and that kind of extends to this game too. Still, it's perfectly fine. As we enter the top 40 titles from Sega's early years, we're starting to get into pretty okay shape, certainly far removed from some of the more cringeworthy titles we've seen so far. Top 40 time, and we begin with one of Sega's cooler maze games, Alibaba and 40 Thieves from 1982. This is definitely different from your regular Pac-Man type game, in that our Arabian hero isn't wholly defenceless. In fact, he can smash through everyone except the Red Captain Thief, and he doesn't even need a power pill for the job. You'll certainly have to work quickly to stop those thieves breaking into his vault and taking all his money to their side of the screen, mind you. There are some quite cool power-ups that do help, including a very cool one that turns Ali into a giant that can absolutely tear through everything. although there is also one that does the same to the Captain Thief, so you've got to be careful. This one is quite fun indeed and certainly quite memorable. So here's Head On from 1979. Actually it's Head On 2, although both the original and sequel are pretty much identical to each other really, so I've combined them into one. This game's actually very important. Believe it or not, it's the first maze game where you have to eat all the on-screen dots. Yep, the release of Head On predated Namco's Pac-Man by a few months. It's not strictly a maze chase game in that the opposing cars you have to avoid are mainly very fast and out of control, although they will certainly crash into you if you're not careful. The gameplay is very simple indeed, with naught but controls for speeding up and changing lanes, but it's held up perfectly well despite its advanced age, and it certainly gets bonus points for importance. Here's 005. Perhaps you've played this if you've ever undertaken some ridiculous and no doubt unfinished project to play every game on MAME alphabetically, seeing as it's one of the first you'll come across. And it's an odd one too. It's a bunch of minigames tied together by you playing as some sort of James Bond-esque spy. Some are fairly mundane, like the forklift game, but then you get the weird one where you've got to collect documents while also skating on an ice rink. And then the whole thing gets very strange with this part where you've got to try and reach the enemy helicopter while shooting down things that appear to be floating trees, and yeah, it's certainly one of the more out there games in Sega's arcade library. Is it good? It's okay, I guess. Long ago, we saw a rather crappy update to this game called RAZZMATAZZ, and now here's the original. Carnival is a very simple arcade game, but quite the impulsive one. The aim of the game is utterly straightforward. It's a classic carnival shooting gallery. You've got ducks, pipes and other things to shoot with BB pellets from your gun at the bottom of the screen, and you simply have to get as high a score as possible with the limited amount of shots you have. It is possible to keep the game going by shooting magazines, but generally the whole thing is over in a couple of minutes. Very simple score attack stuff, the sort of thing I actually do get a little kick out of, to the point where I will happily play through it a couple of times in one sitting. Thoroughly good fun, and no one's fiddled about with the sights on the gun or anything. No carnies here. These early arcades are definitely starting to get enjoyable. Samurai is a single screen affair. You have a samurai, naturally, who can swing his sword about a fair bit, and he has to deal with a room of fairly dim-witted enemies before dealing with a somewhat smarter boss enemy. Generally the best way to take these guys out is to get the low ground on them using your speed to your advantage. You also have to be careful of bolts shot from the top of the screen, meaning you'll want to keep your sword high whenever possible, even if that does mean opening yourself up to a blade in the belly. Tricky little game, but one that I quite enjoy. It's the other arcade game called Commando. Obviously this isn't anything like Capcom's title. This instead is a little single screen game where you play as a tank and you have to master the rather odd hooking trajectory of its shells in order to take down planes. However, you're not quite done there. Once planes go down, their pilots will eject and start interfering with your innermost firmaments. Naughty, very naughty. You've got to carefully blast them before they can stick a grenade on you, and before they start taking over your fortifications. It's often regarded as kinda similar to Missile Command, although this isn't exactly as intense. Quite cool, mind you. Rafflesia is another one for the very generic space shooter pile, but it's quite good compared to most of what we've already seen. The main pull of this one is that the presentation's quite odd. The folks at Hardcore Gaming 101 credit it with a rather moody and oppressive vibe thanks to its droning sound effects and weird flying head bosses that, well, let's face it, you probably won't get to unless you save scum because the game is phenomenally difficult. A red-flagged experts-only old-school shooter. Even if by most measures the game is kind of ordinary, it certainly does stick out in some ways. Just because we're dealing with Sega's early arcade boards and not really touching any of the scaler machines, doesn't mean that they couldn't still pull folks in with a really cool cabinet, and the one for Space Tactics is certainly cooler than most, very large with a seat, proper steering, and chock full of flashing lights and buttons. Not too bad for 1980, huh? You may not get much of an arcade feel simply through playing the game in MAME, but Space Tactics itself is quite cool. It kinda plays like a pseudo 3D Space Invaders, with a little bit more strategy when it comes to timing your more limited missiles. In many ways this is a precursor to the scalar machines that would come later on, meaning that I did wonder if it should be included here or on a later list that specifically deals with the vector and scalar games. It'll probably end up on both of them, as there is a bit more to say about it. Kind of obscure nowadays, but definitely important in the Sega canon. Hopper Robo from a few entries back had the look of a Donkey Kong type game about it, but was also different in a fair few ways. Congo Bongo here is a more straightforward take on Kong, aside from the big difference of it being isometric. The aim of each screen is still to reach the top and force Bongo the ape to move. Why? Well, he played a prank on you by screwing with your tent, so now you're going to set his foot on fire. You bastard. Anywho, it's quite cool actually. There's a bit more variation here than there is in plain old Donkey Kong, there's a fair few traps to watch out for, and the graphics are very nice. It did get a lot of ports in the day, although none of them were anyway close to the arcade. One of Sega's more popular early arcade titles, this one. Ah look, we've got another game that's an awful lot like Xevious. But Starjacker is actually quite neat and addictive. In most cases it is still the same old dealio. You've got ships, you've got bullets, and you can bomb the ground too. Although the new gimmick here is that all your ships are on screen at once, forming a neat line behind you. When you've got 3 ships on the go, you're actually able to lay down quite a decent amount of fire, however you are also easier to hit. You may well prefer having just the one ship, but obviously that means you've only got 1 life left. Kinda cool and certainly changes the gameplay a little bit. I suppose CRESTA did something similar to this as well, although the mechanic in Starjacker has a fair bit of an impact on how the game plays. A very cool game to find just outside the top 30. And that top 30 starts with the first of 2 appearances for one of Sega's early flagship titles. This is Super Zaxxon. As mentioned previously, I'm really bad at Zaxxon. I kinda struggle generally with isometric games like this, especially one where there's so much going on, you have to watch your altitude as well as the enemy ships coming at you, missiles coming from the ground, tunnels and barriers and so many other things. It's sadistic. Still, there's no denying it. Zaxxon and Super Zaxxon are 2 of the most impressive arcades Sega released in their early years, and 2 of the most popular as well. They may not necessarily be my cup of tea, but these early arcade hits helped build Sega's reputation, and so they deserve an appropriate placing. We've had a couple of somewhat questionable titles so far from collabs between Sega and Vic Tokai, but here's one that's weird but also rather good. Calorie-kun vs Moguranian is a strange title where our hero must bump up his kcows by eating everything on screen before time runs out and he gets so thin that he disappears into nothingness. Naturally, evil dietitian monsters are going to try and stop him, although there are a few cheeky ways that you can deal with them, mainly traps that allow you to set off missiles and so on. This has got a few little elements from various games in it, perhaps Dig Dug most of all, but a hefty hunk of oddness makes it memorable and good. Our next game, in at number 29, is Yamato. This 1983 title puts you in control of the doomed Japanese World War II battleship, and your aim is simply to shoot down as many ships and planes as you can. You have 2 different types of shell and 2 different crosshairs. Just as in real life, you will eventually be overcome, and the Yamato will ultimately take its permanent residence at the bottom of the Pacific. But perhaps you'll be able to take down a fair few bogeys before that happens. Actually quite addictive and fun to play in its original arcade form. Bikini girls go up and down, don't follow fashion. Oh, whoops, got lost for a bit there. Anyway, this game is called Up and Down. It's quite a tricky little affair. You've got a somewhat oddly designed bit of urban planning, a strange hexadecimal road filled with hills and gaps that also loops around. Your job is to collect all the flags in each stage as quickly as possible, whilst avoiding all the cars. Usefully, your car can change speed and it can even jump. But you've got to be pretty damn slick at points if you don't want to crash. This is almost like an update to the age-old Head-On, the Pac-Mania to its Pac-Man. I like it. Not every game on here is by Sega. Nobuanka is actually by Data East. However, it does use Sega's System 1 board, meaning that it earns itself a space on here. This game is fairly influential as it's often thought of as one of the first real shoot-'em-ups. Our hero has to climb up a tree whilst shooting or avoiding various miscreants that are approaching you with larcenous intent. Shot enemies do mostly drop fruits that will bump up your score, but watch out, sometimes they drop skulls that will kill you outright if touched. It's a tough game that gets busy very quickly, but it is quite an impulsive one, not to mention very bright and pretty for its time, as you would expect from a shoot-'em-up really. Another very early but also quite popular machine in its day, Borderline came out in 1981 and, like a couple of other games we've seen, particularly 005, takes the form of a couple of different scenes. The aim of each scene is to reach the enemy's refineries with your jeep and take them out, but the way you get there and the obstacles you face changes each time around. The second scene is perhaps most famous, mainly because it is basically Dig Dug only a little while before it. People clearly like this title though, so much so that Sega even saw fit to release it again a few months later as Star Raker, with no changes aside from a mild reskin. That's obviously far too similar to the original game to earn its own spot on the list, but Borderline does well enough all on its own. The titles are most certainly getting stronger. Monster Bash is another multiple scene game, although now the aim is to light up some candles, find your way to a cross, and strike down various classic monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein and all that lot. The Boo Haunted House style aesthetics are somewhat similar to the later Master System game Ghost House. The game itself is a quite loud and boisterous coin-op, one that will certainly grab your attention, and is actually really quite enjoyable despite not being that well known at all. It is very damn sweet when you find a game like Pulsar that has still more than held up, even though it's really close to being 40 years old. This is a maze shooter title, sort of like Berserk only faster, where you need to grab the keys from the top of the screen and take them to the locks near the bottom. Simple enough, right? But there's enemies everywhere for a start. The main mechanic is that the layout of the level is constantly changing. You may think you've got a clear path through the level, but then all of a sudden a single door closing can utterly change everything, and you've got to think fast before the goons surround you. I get a big kick out of this one. It deserves a lot more recognition. But, speaking of recognition, here we've got Zaxxon in its original form. I did kind of say a lot about Zaxxon already when we did its super follow-up a few entries ago, obviously much the same applies here. A very popular game and one that was ripped off itself a fair few times. Kinda funny seeing as we've already seen a fair few of Sega's own rip-off titles in this list. Some of the games that Zaxxon influenced are famous in their own right, games like SNK's Viewpoint, although personally I always got the biggest kick out of Vortex's old game Hate on the Spectrum, which gave you control of both a plane and a tank. Now I may be useless at Zaxxon, but its influence can't be denied. Isometric games just would not be the same without it. Pitfall 2? What's the story behind this one then? Well, simple. This is one of the rare cases of a console game managing to find its way to the arcade instead of the other way around, with Sega themselves creating an arcade version of Activision's classic in 1985. The graphics are a bit more cartoony here than they are in the Atari 2600 game, and even if they're certainly more detailed, your mileage may vary as to whether that's an improvement over the original's more memorable aesthetic. Either way, Sega certainly did do David Crane's title justice. Even if it may be a bit of a throwback by the standards of 1985, Pitfall 2 is still as playable as you would expect such an important platform game to be, with the added bonus of heading into that cave system and trying to grab plenty of goodies. Righto, it's top 20 time, and we start the business end of the list with another quite odd title. There's not many arcade games out there where you control a train, and most of them are more staid affairs like Denture de Go, where you have to stop at platforms and do more traditional trainy things. Here in Super Locomotive, however, you're avoiding enemies, using shields to power your way through obstacles, picking up fuel and generally having an action-packed time of things. Avoiding projectiles and the like can be tricky when you're on rails, but there are ways and means. It's all very fast and accompanied by a chiptune version of Riding by the Yellow Magic Orchestra, which is kinda neat. You won't find too many games like this. However, you can find games like this one on the old microcomputers. Back in the early 80s, the Sheffield-based studio Alligator released Loco for the ZX Spectrum and Suicide Express for the C64, both of which are essentially unofficial ports of this game right here, created by the almighty Anthony Crowther. I actually didn't know this until I booted this game up and saw the similarity, which was kind of fun to see. Those two games are really good, and unsurprisingly this one is too. Okay, this is one of the stranger titles on the list, the sort that could merit a video of its own with a clickbaity title like The Unknown Story of the Obscure Game That Nintendo and Sega Worked On Together, for that is what Space Firebird is. Sort of. Space Firebird is a full-on Nintendo title from 1980 created by R&D1, co-designed by Genyo Takeda and Shigeru Miyamoto. It's not necessarily a totally original title, in many ways it's a lot like Namco's Galaxian, but as you might expect from such a phenomenal duo, the technical prowess and gameplay here is done to a turn. The Sega connection here is actually pretty straightforward. While Nintendo published the game in Japan, Sega Gremlin snapped up the license to publish it in North America. Although that seems to only have been the case for a short time, Western versions of the game do exist without Gremlin's name on it. It's certainly an odd quirk of history, considering what was to come between the two companies. Space Firebird is an obscure game. It came out mere months before Donkey Kong just about blew anything else Nintendo had done in the arcades up to that point away, but it is certainly a quality title that's worth looking at. Another game that was only published by Sega, Jump Bug is quite a nice game where you play as a car that can magically jump about all over the place and collect points, which you must do whilst avoiding enemies. You can jump on anything, including multicoloured buildings and even little fluffy clouds. And as you might expect from the title, the car that you play as does look a little bit like an original Volkswagen Beetle, making this a curio for arcade aficionados and German car fans alike. Seriously though, it's a pretty neat game and cabinet that is worth playing if you happen to see it around. It's often at Play Expos, I've noticed. We're getting on to some of Sega's best early space shooters now. Astro Blaster here from 1981 is a fixed shooter game in a similar vein to Space Invaders or Galaxian, but it's actually a bit more original. You've really got to be quick in this one, not necessarily because the enemies are going to batter you, but because you've got a very limited amount of time in the shape of your fuel gauge to get through sectors. Once it's at 0, the game's done. You do have a little bit of help in the form of a warp that will slow enemies down momentarily and can be used once a sector, but you've got to use it wisely. It's very cool and has a lot of neat presentation, including plenty of speech synthesis. If you don't recognise the game, but it seems familiar, it did get an unofficial port of sorts to the Atari 2600, where it was called Mega Mania. Lovely little game. Here's another game that gets on the list purely due to Sega acquiring a license. Super COBRA is Konami's successor to their early arcade classic, Scramble. The link here is pretty tenuous. It's actually not fully known just what countries Sega distributed the game in, although we do know they had a license for it. Kind of odd. Anyway, Super COBRA is a brutally tricky side-scroller. Just like Scramble, you've got limited fuel, which oddly is regenerated through bombing drums of the stuff on the ground. You're constantly peppered by bullets and missiles and the like, and you have to fit yourself into some incredibly tight passages. It can be a bastard, really. Sometimes in this game you only really survive as long as the game just lets you, and it does feel like it can kill you at a moment's notice. But it is addictive and influential. Lord knows there's tons of games that ripped off Scramble and Super COBRA. It deserves a top 20 spot, certainly. Bank Panic is one of those pretty quirky arcade games that I'm not sure if too many people like all that much, but I do. It's a shooting game, although not a traditional one with a light gun. You play as a bank's guard in the Wild West, and you have to defend the bank from robbers. You cycle through all the bank's doors, monitoring 3 at any one time, and checking those who swing the gates. The 3 doors correspond to your 3 fire buttons. If a robber comes through, you've got to wait until they actually draw to get any kind of bonus for shooting them. Naturally, you lose a life if they shoot you, if you run out of time, and you also lose one if you accidentally gun down an innocent customer. And you go to the next level once you've collected money from each door. I can't help but feel a lot of this bank's issues would be solved if they only had one door, but clearly they need to get all this cash as quickly as possible. That's capitalism for you. Anywho, this game's really quite amusing and maniacal, especially as it kicks on and various different things happen. It's not always as simple as just shooting banditos as soon as they draw down, and you've constantly got to be on your toes. I like this a hell of a lot. Call it Wonder Boy, call it Adventure Island, you can even call it Revenge of Drancon. Either way, this is a very popular Sega arcade, and famous for more than just starting one of the most confusing franchises in gaming. Wonder Boy may not be as in-depth as the adventure-tinged games that would come later on, but it's a cool and fast-moving platformer complete with a super-duper attitudey caveman hero who can chuck hammers and even ride a skateboard, depending on the power-ups he gets. The speed of the game can often result in some irritating deaths that you might struggle to see coming, but it's still a really addictive game despite that, certainly the most gripping game we've seen so far. And of course it does come with one of the most irritatingly catchy earworm arcade tunes in the history of gaming that I'm reasonably sure you're humming to yourself right now. You're welcome, by the way. Unlucky for some, number 13 is home to another cool title that's not very well known, Spatter. This rather cutesy little game seems to be completely forgotten by Sega, which is a shame. You play as a kid on a tricycle who has to collect all the flowers in the maze while avoiding the enemies. This may not seem like much, basically a souped up version of Rally X, but there are other features. You can use the fences that make up the maze to dodge enemies, you can jump over them, and you can even push blocks into them. It's quite similar in many ways to Flicky, which we're going to be seeing later on, right down to getting a bigger bonus if you complete the stage quickly. This really deserves to be much better known, and it's sad that it's never appeared on any collections whatsoever. A very cool game. Our number 12 game is much better known, and it's another game that Sega got a license for. Nihon Busan's utterly classic Moon CRESTA was distributed by Sega under the Gremlin label in North America, with a few little tweaks. Moon CRESTA is good and influential enough to just about be considered the third point in a classic single-screen space shooter trifecta, Space Invaders at the front, this and Galaxian on the sides. It's more than held up nicely, being considerably quirkier than those two titles, what with the strange enemy behaviour and your segmented ship that often has to be docked and behaves differently depending on how much of it is left. Had some pretty awesome ports too, like the Spectrum one, which was kind of dismissed at the time due to the game's age but is really quite faithful. It's a classic and you don't really need me to tell you this. Choplifter was one of several Western computer games to really benefit from Japanese interest, along with the likes of Karateka and, in particular, Lode Runner. Dan Gorlin's classic was recreated magnificently by Sega for the arcades. It's a bit more simmy than a lot of arcade games when it comes to how the chopper controls, although still playable by basically anyone. It's full of personality when it comes to all those little people you have to rescue. And who boy is it punishing. There are few bigger you screwed up moments in gaming than when you've got a chopper filled with civvies and you manage to get yourself shot down. The game even laughs at you as it sends the dead counter skyrocketing. Choplifter is a cruel mistress and an awesome game, savage though it may be. We have had an awful lot of titles, but we're now finally in the top 10. You might be a bit surprised to see something like Regulus here. We talked a fair bit about Xevious rip-offs earlier on when we covered games like Guardio and Starjacker, and Regulus is undoubtedly the most blatant of all Sega's Xevious takes. I mean, even the frickin' name sounds familiar. And yet I do have a massive soft spot for the game. I think it looks awesome and super clean, plays smoothly and is surprisingly difficult to put down. That and it's also a meaty challenge, plenty of little nooks and crannies that you have to fit your tank through, usually while enemies are attempting to take you out by the score. So while it is basically Xevious with tanks, Regulus totally nails that concept, creating a game that's just as fun and playable as Namco's much better known title. They actually make quite a neat little couple in all honesty. It's funny. Early on in the list I happily took the piss out of games like Tranquilizer Gun for not exactly being in good taste nowadays, quite hilarious to look back on. But, here in the top 10, we have Bullfight. I mean, there's hardly much demand for matadors nowadays, is there? I can't even think of too many other games where you play as a matador besides this one. The aim is just as you would expect. You've got a sword and a red rag, you must goad the bull and get into a position where you can stab it right in that dot between the shoulders. Naturally, you've got to get close to do that, and in doing so there's a good chance that you're going to get gored and flung out of the ball ring. You'll want to do it quickly too, otherwise you might end up having to deal with 2 balls instead of 1. The game is certainly quite explicit if you do succeed. The ball falls down and dies when blood starts dripping out of its mouth as the crowd roars. Congratulations! You sure do seem happy for a murderer. But the game is so much fun and there's barely anything else like it. It's full of risks and dashing moves and it's certainly satisfying in a quite gory way. So yeah, you don't feel bad for too long. It would certainly have been Ernest Hemingway's favourite game, that's for sure, if he was alive. Another very famous game. Pengo is about as popular as the likes of Zaxxon and synonymous with their early days in the arcade before the likes of Space Harrier and OutRun hit the floor. With that in mind, it's surprising that the game received comparatively few ports compared to Zaxxon and others, although there were more than a few clones of the title back in the day. This is a really sweet game where the aim is to crush the absolute expletive out of those who dare chase you with ice blocks, something that's very satisfying indeed, especially because they can be devious, aggressive, and actually not that easy to hit. It's kind of easy to be all too predictable in Pengo, whereas you've got to be sneaky yourself and lure these snowbees into the dulcet sounds of the electronic classic Popcorn. If you're really good, you can even line up the diamond blocks and get a bonus. If you're bad like me, you'll probably end up just getting murdered. Either way, you'll most likely enjoy yourself tremendously. Here's a cool title that might be more familiar as a Master System game. Teddy Boy Blues. There doesn't ever seem to be too much to this one. All you've got to do is jump around a bit and shoot some enemies. But it does get panicky quite sharpish when there's a lot of enemies bouncing around and moving very quickly. Even the incredibly basic look of the game is somewhat endearing. It's all just done in a flash and tons of good fun. Amusingly, the whole thing is named after a popular single by a Japanese pop star Yoko Ishino. Naturally, you have to save her from these dicebox denizens, and a cool version of the song plays on the soundtrack. All of that provides the game a nice little touch of weirdness to boot. A really lovely game. It's been fun to have games that Sega simply licensed coming into this list, almost as if they're doing cameos, and Frogger, right here at number 6, is both the biggest and the best. Once again, it's a case of Sega and Gremlin publishing the game in North America, and I'm sure it was undoubtedly a bit of a boon for them to end up with such a hit. Konami's game, after all, hardly needs an introduction. This is one of the most iconic games of the arcade golden age. I have said in the past that I'm not exactly good at Frogger, but that hardly impacts my enjoyment. This is Frog vs Car in desperate battle. Constant frenzied moving around, trying to avoid seeing your hero getting turned into roadkill, timing things in the later levels so you've got enough time on those lilies before they sink, just trying desperately to fill that blasted well on the far left. One of the most iconic single screen games in arcade history, and once I knew that I was putting these games in, Frogger was obviously going to place high. The top 5 begins with Wonder Boy in Monsterland. West 1 get involved and immediately our hero's quest takes on a different hue. The simple scrolling of the original has now been enhanced with RPG style elements like getting money, buying different equipment, increasing your life bar and so forth. This may well feel a lot more like a console game than an arcade game to some, although it makes more sense to a Japanese public previously weaned on highly successful games like Namco's Tower of Juaga. Indeed, the arcade version of this game actually never came out in the West officially. There was no Monsterland arcade version until it got a translation on Wii's Virtual Console many years later. And weirdly, I did actually play this back in the day. How come? Well, I have a strong memory of playing this in Spain, and what I played was undoubtedly an old bootleg that helpfully tried to translate the game somewhat. I believe that this old bootleg version is what I'm playing here. It's nice to recall such memories, and even if this game may better be suited to any of its very good home versions, it's still an excellent arcade. Awesomely, the flat-out weirdest title in the whole of this list is also one of the best. Presenting I'm Sorry, Sega's most entertaining old maze game. It looks simple enough, doesn't it? All you have to do is pick up the various gold bars dotted around the level and take them back to the bank. Ideally, you'll bring them all back at once for a big bonus. You can punch the enemies in a pinch, and there's a barrel that's constantly after you which you can jump over. All very good and very, very playable. But the presentation sets it apart. This is that rare beast, a highly politicised arcade game. An example of Japanese satire through ludicrous caricature, legitimately one of the funniest games of its day. I'm Sorry is actually a send-up of a scandal-hit former Japanese Prime Minister named Kakue Tanaka, and the game takes aim at him being generally quite greedy, hence why he's grabbing all this gold. The game features several famous celebrities too, and they'll subject poor old Tanaka to some quite embarrassing punishments if they catch up. The Japanese comedian Tamori will even shove an apple in his mouth and whip him, S&M style. He'll catch a good old-fashioned chop-in from frickin' giant Bubba. Even Carl Lewis, Michael Jackson and Madonna are lining up to give him his just desserts. This is such an interesting and cool game. Perhaps the silliest thing is that despite being so utterly Japanese and steeped in Japanese politics and Japanese culture, I'm Sorry actually did receive a Western localization. A lot of the context for the game may well be totally lost on Western folk, but it's still a great game to play regardless, as well as actually being hilarious too. Politics in old arcade games? Politics that are really funny? You betcha. I'm Sorry's got it all. Another one that I kinda know and love already. This is Sega Ninja, also known as Ninja Princess, and it's the original arcade version of one of the best games on the Master System, that one that's simply known as The Ninja. The Master System version was cleaned up and expanded a little, making it a little better than the arcade original, but this one's still got most of the scenes from the regular top-down stages to the trickier blighters where you're dodging rocks or jumping on logs, and you've still got the controls. You can fire in 8 directions, you can strafe and fire straight upwards, and if you're in a very tight spot you can temporarily disappear. This is always very satisfying to pull off, especially when you actually avoid something with it. By and large, this game is much the same as the Master System title, although the hero's gender was changed along the way for whatever reason. Bluntly put, the game's bloody brilliant. It's no surprise that it would feature right at the very top of both this and the Master System list. In at number 2, we have an absolute shocker. A game that I'd never heard of at all before I started compiling this list. It's one that I've become quite addicted to because it's freaking awesome. A stone cold classic from Sega that shockingly never got ported anywhere and is quite the obscurity nowadays. Heavy Metal. I can see why this might be obscure. On the surface of things it looks like just another arcade tank shooter. I mean, it's Regulus, isn't it? It's just that the sprites are a little closer in. And yeah, I can see that. Most of Heavy Metal is simply a well-made tank shooter, just like Regulus, just like Jackal or various other games. But there's the addition of one simple game-changing mechanic. You'll notice that you have a radar of sorts on the side of the screen that blips with targets far in the distance. Well, Heavy Metal gives you a really frickin' big cannon and allows you to take shots all the way to the other end of the level at these targets. And when those shots hit, it's brilliant. This is an incredibly satisfying mechanic. Naturally, a lot of these blips on the radar are going to be firing big shells in your direction too, so you better watch out for that and get them as soon as you can. And while doing this, you've still got to deal with all the trappings of a more traditional shooter, with enemies that are fighting at much closer quarters. This cocktail of gameplay is utterly bloody great, to the point where I'm surprised I haven't seen it in so many other games. A shooter where you can blast certain enemies long before you actually reach them. It's so simple that it's brilliant. I adore Heavy Metal for this to the point where it was enough to get all the way to number 2, beating games that I know a hell of a lot better. It's wonderful to be surprised by an old title in such a way, one of the best things about doing this. In the end, however, there's good old familiarity at the top of the charts. I did mention Spatter's similarity to Flicky in that game's entry, and said that we would be seeing Flicky later on, and as it turns out we're seeing Flicky right here at the very top. This is, after all, a game that I will champion relentlessly. A favourite arcade of mine. It's also got an awesome and very faithful version on the Mega Drive that no one loved at the time because it was deemed old hat. It's simply one of the fastest platformers around with some of the smoothest, utterly natural jumping that you'll find. You can do so much with Flicky, and it's so satisfying when you pull off the cooler tricks like jumping directly up to another platform or taking a huge jump that appeared impossible. All this and, of course, maintaining a healthy line of little chicks behind you, keeping them away from cats and rats and other assorted baddies. Completing the level quickly and efficiently in Flicky is one of the most awesome things in the world, while completing the level sketchily and messily, usually as the result of being knocked down by a feline, is one of the most panicky things, desperately trying to pick up all those chicks, chasing after those bloody fast ones with the sunglasses, again avoiding the damned animals and ideally bonking them with various appliances that dot the stage. It's all quite simple really, and most stages should ideally be done in seconds, especially if you want those bonuses, but it's one of the most addictive games that I've ever come across. I'm happy that someone at Sega clearly thought a lot of it, enough for it to get that Mega Drive port, enough for it to have a little cameo in Sonic games later on. I love Flicky so much, one of my favourite old arcades. In the end, it got top spot pretty bloody easily, it has to be said. So that'll do us for this rather extensive list covering Sega's games from the early years, going through what most people would call a golden age of arcade gaming. A lot of these games are generally before my time, so I guess this list is a little bit light on arcade memories, but hopefully it's heavy on unearthing some interesting games from Sega's long arcade history, particularly ones that deserve a lot more recognition. We'll certainly be seeing a lot of that in the next video. We're going to be jumping to the late 80s and early mid 90s for systems 18, 24, 32 and C. If you think we've seen some odd games in this video, I'm telling you, you've seen nothing yet. That's coming soon. But in the meantime, I'm just left to say, bye for now! Thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked this video, well, please do like it, leave some cool comments and do all that other YouTube thing that you hear in 99% of all other YouTube videos. Follow me on Twitter, have a look at my Twitch, those are other places where you can generally find me. And if you really like what I do, and you want to see some exclusive stuff like wrestling documentaries and the like, perhaps have a look at my Patreon. You can join this list of awesome people right here. Alexa Jones Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Arcade LY Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalior, Rimwan Sutter, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Daniel Lomez, Danny Wolfers, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Maiden, Geordie Alex, Glunfeth, J.S. Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kuligovsky, Mateus Gramzov, Michael, Mike Clayton Travis, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Neem Kean, Peter Margel, Ren Bimon, Robert De Felice, Rusty Kelly, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the awesome community, thank you so much, and goodbye.